All right. Well, thank you so much, Reverend Wilson. Um, Next, our speaker is a very well-known nurse researcher here in the Rochester community. Dr. Natalie LeBlanc is an interdisciplinary nurse research scientist with a more than 20-year career in public health, nursing, and health research. She investigates the ecological, cultural, and systematic factors that influence health and wellness outcomes. As a former public health specialist, Dr. LeBlanc is able to critically assess health issues from both public health and clinical perspectives, globally and domestically. As a nurse researcher, she seeks to address and investigate determinants of health disparities, assets within these factors that can be leveraged towards achieving health equity to inform intervention implementation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Natalie LeBlanc.
Good afternoon, everyone. See a lot of familiar faces. Nice to see you. And thank you, Reverend Wilson and Dr. Stamps for inviting me today. I wanted to speak to the Loving Well Project. I know Reverend Jackson spoke. She's one of my partners in crime in this. And considering an HIV status neutral paradigm when we think about HIV. Okay. I'm not going to go over any statistics. Sorry, next slide. Not going to go over any statistics. Reverend Jackson brought us to where we needed to be. But one of the things that I think is really important when I hear stats about conditions and illness and disease is that I think it's important, particularly looking through the room, that we understand that Black people are not inherently sick. We're not inherently diseased. We don't hold illness just because it's not a biological thing. It is the context that we live in. It's the history that we've had in this country that has weared the body down, that affects our mental health. However, in that, we still have resiliency. We still have self-determination. So a lot of the disparities that we see are due to racism, particularly anti-Black racism. So I'm very specific when I talk about racism affected by Black folk, that Black folk are affected by. And so I just want us to be clear on that, because I still come across people within community who are doing the work, but who do possess some of this belief that we're sick people, and we're not, okay? Next slide, sorry. So to kind of speak to the context that we live in, I want to go over 3 studies that me and my team have kind of gone through, and we're in the process of recruiting, but also we're towards the end for some other studies. And the first is called Living Her Best Life. This was a study done with Black women who are longtime survivors or lifelong survivors living with HIV in New York State. And some of the most compelling features of these women was that almost all of them had a history of childhood sexual assault. So they're going through life trying to manage what was done to them as children, whether it's engaging in substance use, whether it's having partners that were violent. And so a lot of this was left unaddressed over the years. Many of them no longer trusted people. Many of them, however, all of them were in treatment. And they spoke about that with great pride. You sat down with them, they said, I'm undetectable, meaning they are being treated for HIV. And that was one of the things that was very important for them in their survivorship. Many of them didn't think they would become mothers, let alone grandmothers, and they are. And so one of the other things that I do want to mention, what was very important in their journeys is support. Social support groups were really, really important for these women, for many of these women. Many of these women, I should say, also mention, moved to New York State from other states and from other countries because of the support that they knew they would receive here. Okay. The second study, next slide, please, is what we call the PrEP Pleasure and Partner study. This focused on Black and Latino people of the trans experience and other gender nonconforming folk. Okay. With most of the participants were Black and Latina transgender women. And what was some of the compelling features of these women was that there was a history of childhood poverty. Okay. There was community-level experiences of anti-Blackness and also transphobia. There was a lot of stigma and isolation. And homelessness was very prevalent among this group. Some were living with HIV, others weren't. Those living with HIV were in care. Those who were not, some of them were on pre-exposure prophylaxis. And like the previous group, many of them all of them are from New York State, or in New York State, but many of them came from other states, from the South in particular. Some of them came from other countries to get the support that they needed to live their best life, or as close to it as possible. And the other thing I want to mention is that with this particular group, they spoke to, particularly among those who were aging, because for the first time they're living longer, right? They spoke about spirituality being part of their sexual health and wellness. They spoke about their spirituality being part of, if they're living with HIV, being on treatment, of having support so that for the first time in their lives, they're housed and they get to choose who their partner is. All right, that's what support does. Next slide. The last study I wanted to touch base on, also done in New York State. I am a native New Yorker from New York, so I want to find out more about our folk and see how we can help and intervene and help each other and love each other. And so the second study focused on Black men who have sex with men who had a history of crystal meth use. And some were living with HIV, some were not. But crystal meth as a substance tends to be associated with enhancing pleasure. That's what the literature tells us. But what we found out with this study and others like it that focus on Black men who have sex with men, it was not about that. Many of them were introduced to these substances without their consent. They thought they were taking something else, and somebody put this into their, to whatever it was they were taking. It was sometimes used in the context of sexual assault. Many of them had a history of childhood trauma, of poverty, of incarceration, of homelessness, the use of other substances. And many men who were not living with HIV reported that it felt like they had to have HIV to get the support that they felt they needed, particularly when it came to housing. And so continued use of the substance was around coping, not pleasure. And one of the things that was remarkable about the men that we had interviewed, they worked towards sobriety on their own. Many of them didn't join a rehab because they felt that the support services weren't there for them. And so they're working towards sobriety, and all of them were sober by the time we did the interview, was around resiliency and self-determination. They got tired of being tired. They got tired of seeing people around them not be well. And then they found people who were supportive of their journey. And I highlight those, next slide please, because I want to speak to the status neutral paradigm. So testing is how you enter into HIV prevention and care. But as our participants in those studies showed, is that whether you're living with HIV or not, a lot of the social determinants and structural determinants needed to be addressed before they could be well. Okay. However, next slide, please. We can't wait for systems to catch up to our reality. To utilize a status-neutral HIV prevention and care paradigm, meaning you have to rethink what you do. And these are for all different institutions, for different programs, to really be able to provide the prevention, treatment, and care that people need. So a status-neutral framework requires rethinking and reconfiguring. However, in the meantime, we can leverage spaces and places for support. We can tap into our own wisdoms and energies and strengths. As the participants in these studies have shown that you can be resilient, that you can have self-determination, and that these things are key. And so I wanted to just share the Serenity Prayer. This is something my grandmother would share with me anytime we would close our conversations over the phone. You know, focus on the things that you can change. Not saying that you shouldn't try to change the things you don't think you can change, because you can change those too, but focus on the things that you can change. So tapping into this is the understanding that our susceptibility to HIV and HIV treatment is really an extension of our sexual health, wellness, and well-being. That sexual health, wellness, and well-being is connected to our mental health, and as some of these participants had noted, is connected to their spiritual health as well. And sexual health is part of our overall health and wellness. And so I was listening to, I think it was Toni Morrison the other day, and she talked about in an interview how one of the hardest things for us to do as Black people because of our history is to love ourselves. It's been a challenge for us. However, what resiliency and self-determination shows is that we can move there. Right? Next step. And so a small group of us have been working to curate what we've called the Loving Well Project, using a spiritual and strength-based perspective and lens to address sexual health, wellness, and well-being, but embedded within that is HIV prevention, treatment, and care. And looking more broadly, we're talking about overall health and wellness, okay? Mental health, spiritual health, all the things. And so this is where we get to promote a love ethic for the self, to address not only HIV prevention, treatment, and care, but also sexual health, wellness, and well-being, and overall well-being. Next slide, please. So in promoting a love ethic in sexual, mental, spiritual health, and wellness, we can think about loving well and how we view and treat ourselves. So I know Reverend Jackson went over some of this. And so I brought here this quote by Audre Lorde, which I think taps into what Maya Angelou was speaking to in terms of sometimes it's hard for us to love ourselves and therefore to love other people. But also at first we have to be kind to ourselves. So Audre Lorde talks about we have to consciously study how to be tender with each other until it becomes a habit. We can practice being gentle with ourselves by being gentle with each other. We can practice being gentle with each other by being gentle with a piece of ourselves that is hardest to hold, and sometimes that's our history. Right? Next slide, please. In some belief systems, it is understood that God is everywhere. Like if you're familiar with the Ghanaian culture, they have a philosophy called Gyanyame, which means God is omnipotent, God is everywhere. And if God is everywhere, then God is in part in us. And if God is everywhere, that means God is in every other person that we come across. So we can take cues from bell hooks and again from scripture that love is an action, not just a feeling. That we can love the God in us and then love the God in others and act on that. Next slide, please. I usually put this here because sometimes I speak to young people. And what we find with young people is that they're just looking for connection. And so as the adults and the support in their lives, we have to be able to show them that there's other ways of connecting with people. And although with HIV and other STIs, we see it across the age spectrum, but we know our young people are disproportionately impacted. They make up 50% of sexually transmitted infections. And so if we can help them, if we can support them in knowing that there's other ways to show that you love someone, There's other ways to be intimate, and not just young people, across the age group, but show that there's other ways of appreciating and loving the God in someone else that would help address what we see in terms of sexual health, wellness, and well-being, mental health, wellness and well-being, spiritual health and wellness and well-being, and overall health and well-being. Next slide, please. And so loving well is also recognizing that we are sexual and spiritual beings at the same time. There's nothing wrong with that. We have a lot of tools in our toolbox to ensure that we are safer about practices, and that, next slide please, and that for some people, the way they move, next slide please, the way they move through the world is greatly tied to their belief around God and spirituality. Okay, here we have Janelle Monáe, who talks about being non-gender conforming, non-binary, and she's like, I feel all of my energy. You know, I feel like God is so much bigger than the he or the she. And if I am God, I just see everything I am, right? So she's loving herself and appreciating herself, and therefore has the energy to love and appreciate other people. Next slide. Loving well in community is seeing the light in each other, okay? We had the Bell Hooks quote earlier. This is from people who may be a bit more well-known. Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X speak to loving the light in each other, about love being more than romantic. It's just loving the humanity in each other, to care for each other, and also to care for ourselves. I'm not going to read each quote, but, and then next slide. So what we would like you to walk away with is, what does loving well look like for you? What can it look like for the people in your home, the people in your community? It's also a way that we, approach conversation and discussion, not only about HIV prevention, treatment, and care, but about loving of oneself as part of our overall health, wellness, and well-being. And so I leave you with these questions. Next slide. And I'll leave you with this quote. And I feel this way not only as a researcher, but also when I speak to participants and they're sharing some of the most traumatic experiences of their lives, but also those experiences that bring them joy. If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see. And that's from James Baldwin. I just have a QR code. Part of the Loving Well project is gathering from people their thoughts about loving well, what it could mean to them. This is a QR code for a survey. I have a little gift card if you fill it out that I can give you, but I'll leave with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. LeBlanc. Very impressive research and so much of what we need today. Thank you, thank you. Next on our agenda is Dr. Candace Backus. Dr. Candace Backus is a PharmD and is a medical scientist for Gilead Sciences. Previously, she was the assistant professor of population health sciences at the University of Mississippi Medical Center and served as a preceptor for pharmacy students and residents. She also is a member of the faculty for the Southeast AIDS Education Training Center and the clinical pharmacist for Mississippi's largest Ryan White Clinic, approximately 2,200 patients. Her clinic responsibilities, including caring for the primary care needs of people living with HIV and at risk for contracting HIV. She is also grant funded for the implementation science projects such as pharmacist-led rapid PrEP initiation programs, a teleprep program, a teleprimary care program, and a relinkage to HIV care program in rural Mississippi. She has also co-led a support group for transgender women living in Jackson, Mississippi. She has obtained her undergraduate degree from Arizona State University, spent several years in research studying breast cancer. In this lab, she tested preclinical drugs on animal models and cell lines, searching for treatment for a rare form of breast cancer that disproportionately impacts African Americans and Latinos. During that time, she obtained her master's degree in biomedical sciences and was accepted into pharmacy school. In 2017, she obtained her Doctor of Pharmacy degree from the University of Mississippi. She completed a residency with Open Arms Healthcare Center and Walgreens. Her residency was focused on cultural competency, HIV treatment, and prevention and qualitative research techniques. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Candace Backus.
All right. Thank you all for having me. Thank you for hosting. All right. So today we're going to have a conversation. Is that okay? All right. So that means that two things. There's two things when I have a conversation. One, if I say something that upsets you or offends you that you don't like, you got to tell me in the very moment I say it. So I leave here better than I came. Okay? You can do that? Okay. The second thing is that you can't let me talk by myself, right? It's a lot of stuff in my brain, but it's a lot of stuff I don't know. So I don't know what I don't know. I don't know what you don't know. I don't know what you want to hear unless you tell me. So we're going to have a conversation. My slides are only to help guide the conversation. They are not intended to dominate the conversation. All right? Okay? All right. So next slide, please. So I have some objectives because that tries to keep me honest because I'll go off on a tangent. And so you got to be like, well, you didn't cover all the stuff you said you were going to cover. So this is going to keep me honest. These are things we're going to talk about. All right? All right. Next slide. So Ms. Jackson talked a little bit about HIV and AIDS. Do we know the difference? Do we have any ideas, any thoughts about the difference between HIV and AIDS? Anything that you've heard, that you've learned? Don't get quiet on me now. Y'all promised you were going to talk to me. That's not wrong, but it kind of stigmatizes a little bit, right? What happens is there are people living today that are living with AIDS, right? Do we know that? And there are people that are living today that are living with HIV. Now, do we know that you can be diagnosed with AIDS today and then you can move back to HIV a couple weeks from now? See, that's important. That's important. Because we have this idea that people that are living with AIDS are walking around looking decrepit and they're looking sick, and that's not necessarily the case, right? The difference between HIV and AIDS is literally your body's ability to fight off a very simple disease or illness like the common cold. If I have AIDS, the common cold is going to take me out. I'm going to be sick. If I have HIV and I get the common cold, I'm all right. That means that my immune system, my body can fight that off. But if I have AIDS, that means that my body is too busy fighting the HIV virus, so it doesn't have time for anything else. Yes, ma'am. Yes, there is a difference, and that's what I'm talking about. So the CD4 is your immune system, right? Your body's little fighters that fight off any invader that comes into your body and wants to take over. So if you have HIV, that means that your CD4 is above 200. So most people, with the exception of kids, because their CD4 is a little different, most individuals who are living a healthy life, even if they're living with HIV, their CD4 is going to be probably close to 1,000. When you contract AIDS, it drops below 200, and that's when people get different types of pneumonia, they get like opportunistic infections, they get all these other things because their body is too weak to fight off these very basic things. Okay? So HIV does not equal AIDS. And if you have AIDS and you get on medication, you can move back to HIV. Yes, they will go back up. The medicines are so good that they can go back up. And if you decide to stop taking your meds, if I'm living with HIV and I decide to stop taking my meds, guess what? It can go down. And I can then be clinically classified as AIDS. It is literally just a clinical classification. It doesn't define anybody. It is a classification that you can move in or out of. To AIDS, okay, that's a very good question. Why would you want to know if you have HIV as opposed to AIDS? If I have AIDS, then I need to take more medication than just my HIV medication. I need to take medication to prevent me from some of these opportunistic infections like PCP pneumonia, which is what was very, very common in the early days. That's the one thing we always hear about, right? PCP pneumonia. So we know that I would need something to protect me from that. Okay? Any other questions? Thank y'all for playing. I love this. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so me, very much like Dr. LeBlanc, I really like to talk about black people because I'm black, right? And I like to have a real candid conversation about what's happening to us, why it's happening to us, and what we can all do about it to help everybody that looks like us. So this slide looks at the 10 states, and this is a little bit old because the CDC's data is not necessarily that trustworthy because we have a really interesting government happening right now. And then it takes a little while for that data to actually get to the government and then them to actually tabulate it. So this is a little bit old. But you're looking at the top states, top 10 states by numbers of HIV diagnosis among black people. And you see that New York State is pretty high. Now, what's interesting about New York State is New York State was one of the first states to have an actual statewide ending HIV epidemic program. And we still have a lot of HIV among black people. Any thoughts as to why? Why it's us that's still leading, even though we have all these programs? Stigma? Okay. Okay, yes. Good. All good thoughts, all good thoughts. Any other thoughts about that? I'm sorry? Education. Yes, that's a big one. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about that education. All right, next slide. Dr. LeBlanc talked about this, but I wanted to make it very clear that when we look at HIV acquisitions, it is largely heterosexual contact, especially among black women. Now, depending on who you ask, some people are gonna say black women are contracting HIV because they're having sex with black men who are on the down low, who don't want to disclose that they're also having sex with men. Now, that might be true, but I don't know if 50% of black women that are living with HIV or that are newly diagnosed is because their partner is also sleeping with men. I could be wrong, but I think that the black church is a little bit more accepting. Is that right? Okay. So I don't necessarily know if that's still true. It may have been true at one time, but I don't know if that's still true. So there's a lot of misinformation out here about why women are contracting HIV, why black people are living with HIV, why the numbers are higher in our community. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about how we got here. We'd like to talk about the fact that in 2024, black women were leading the HIV epidemic, and we like to talk about in 1983, these men were dying, but we never talk about where black people were at the beginning, right? 50% of pediatric AIDS cases in blacks in 1984. So that means there are lots of people that have spent their entire life living with HIV, not because they did anything, not because they had sex with the wrong person, but because they were literally born into the world, and with that came HIV for them. But we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that 50% of female AIDS cases were black in 1986. This isn't new. We just decided now that it's important to talk about it. Somebody decided now that black and brown people were important to have the conversation. Not because we just started, the problem just started. It's because now the conversation has shifted, and the conversation has largely shifted because, y'all want me to tell you the truth? The conversation has shifted is because now we've saturated the where we can get money, right? I work for a for-profit organization, makes HIV treatment and prevention medications. We spent 35 years talking to gay white men, and then we shifted and talked to gay black men. Now who's left to talk with? It's not new, it's just a new revenue source. Right? So while all these things were happening in the black community, of course we thought this was a gay disease, right? So when you saw those pictures of all those men dying in the hospitals, it was rows and rows of men, and they were labeling those men as gay. I have no idea if those men were gay. They were literally on their deathbed. I don't know who they had slept with, and I don't know if they would remember they were on their deathbed. Those men were on their deathbed, and they had said that these men had this gay disease and that they were dying. So was our community. But we weren't on the news. We weren't on the cover. Oh, yes, go ahead. Yes and no. Yes, so that is a good point. The early epidemic, there is that component of the drug use and the impact in the black community. Absolutely. That absolutely plays a role, but it's not the only thing that played a role, right? Right? Yeah, it does factor into that, right? We do know that there are a lot of individuals, like the use of substances during sex and after sex is not a new concept, right? And a use of substances to just cope, right? To just cope with whatever situation someone's dealing with is not new. And so when people use substances, they're not always thinking clearly. And so some of the things that happen are they may have sex with somebody that they wouldn't have wanted to have sex with had they had been fully present. They'd been like, that's not somebody I would willingly choose, right? Okay, next slide. You know, Ms. Jackson talked about starting medications as soon as possible, and we know that the literature supports that. The literature supports that the earlier you start medications, then the more likely you are to stay on those medications, the more likely you are to not have additional complications, right? When we look at who often hesitates to start, it's usually us. But we never talk about why we hesitate to start. We never talk about how we were denied the medication, right? We didn't just wake up and decide that we didn't want to take care of ourselves. It's because we've been in those situations where we needed something and someone denied it. And so now that you're willing to give it, sometimes people are a little confused as to why. Why are you so quick to help me now when you weren't quick to help me before? And so I try to remind people. I remember when I had this patient, so I had did all this training. I had came into this clinic, and I was the only black person in the clinic. I went in this room, and I saw this black woman. I said, oh, yeah, I can talk to her. She black, I'm black. We're going to have a good conversation. She humbled me real quick. I went in that room. I said, she hadn't been taking her medicine. I went there, I said, why are you not taking your medicine? She jumped up at me. She said, you can't come in here telling me I ain't been taking my medicine. Who you think you talking to? Just because you black don't mean you can tell me what to do. I said, oh, she's right. She's right. I made assumptions about who she was. I knew she wasn't taking her medicine, but I made assumptions about why she wasn't taking her medicine. I didn't have all my facts together, right? I didn't have the historical perspective as to she wasn't offered medication. She wasn't given a choice. She wasn't given a say. So I told her I was going to leave the room. I'm going to leave the room and come back in. We're going to start over. I left the room. I came back in. I apologized to her, and I said, okay, I want to talk to you about your medication. Are you having any problems with your medication? Yeah, I'm not taking it. Okay, let's talk about why. Somebody had given her that prescription without asking her how she felt about it. The pill size was too big for her. But no one included her in the conversation. So she just said, I'm not taking it. And then here I am trying to figure out, well, this is supposed to be saving your life. Why are you not taking it? We hadn't had a conversation. No one talked to her about her options. No one included her in the conversation. They made assumptions about who she was and decided what was okay for her without including her in the conversation. She still didn't like me the 5 years I spent in that clinic, but she did start taking her medication. We did get her on some medicine that she liked, but I tell you, she was not a fan of mine. But it's important to recognize that someone like her who had been living with HIV for over 20 years, she had come into this with, she had come into this situation, there were certain assumptions that had been made about her, certain things that had been put on her, and she hadn't been involved in the conversation. And when she saw me, she was tired of it. Because she said, I took it from these white people, I'm not going to take it from you. She made that very clear. And we got her on something, and she was able to do a lot better, but recognizing where people are and where they've come from and what they've brought with them is really important. Next slide. So the really important stuff I highlighted in red, because I always see a lot of timelines, and the timelines never include things that are specific to Black people, right? They always include these timelines around when people were dying and when the first medication was approved, but they never talk about things that are going to really impact us as Black people. In 1990, Black women accounted for more than 52% of AIDS cases among U.S. women. Largest affected group among all women were Black women in 1990. So there's no secret today as to why Black women account for more than 50% of all HIV diagnoses among women, right? It was a problem in 1990 that nobody talked about. So we can't all believe that since 1990, Black women have all been sleeping with men who've been sleeping with other men. We got way too many Black men for that to be happening, right? For every last one of the Black women to contract HIV because a man was sleeping with another man. That may account for some of it, but not all of it. Magic Johnson. If that's not a very controversial topic, I talk to people about Magic Johnson, they say, oh, he's cured. Magic Johnson take a pill every day. But you would never know that he was living with HIV if he hadn't told you, right? He takes a pill every day. Lots of other people take a pill every day, and you would never know they were living with HIV. There are still some communities, like African immigrants, who still believe that you can look at somebody and tell that they're living with HIV. You cannot look at someone and tell if they're living with HIV. You just can't. So the importance around having a conversation around getting tested is really important. I've lived in Rochester for almost 6 years. Before that, I lived in the South. Y'all can probably hear it. I say some words and hear that little Southern drawl. Every time I go to my primary care, I always have to ask for my HIV test. The only time I didn't is when I went to the OBGYN. She's like, you want an HIV test? I was like, yeah, girl, let's get one. Any other time, I have to ask, and that should not be the case. It's recommended that you get an HIV test at least once in your lifetime, which I think is absolutely insane. Anyone who's engaging in sex should be getting an HIV test every year. I've been married almost 20 years, and I get HIV tests every year. I know what I do every day. I know what he's supposed to be doing, but I'm not betting my life on it. That's not a bet I'm willing to cover. And I love him to death. but I'm always going to check on me, and I advise him to check on him. In some communities, in our black gay male community, they do a better job of having this conversation around HIV testing and status. It's something that we have almost beat into that community, because a lot of times, especially the older people, older meaning like 30 and up, the younger kids, they didn't really get that. But a lot of individuals that are like 30 and up, they know, they have that conversation, they're willing to have that conversation, they're willing to get tested. It's part of what they feel they need to do to keep themselves safe. It's part of the foreplay. The rest of us haven't gotten there yet, but we need to, right? Knowing someone's HIV status is really important, because then you can decide how you want to proceed. Now, I had a patient, she had gotten raped, and that's how she contracted HIV. And it had really upset her, and it really impacted her life. She had to stop working. And so she would come to the clinic, and one day she had met this man. And she was like, oh, I think I want to have sex with this man. And she's like, should I tell him about my HIV status? I said, you trying to have sex with him today? She said, no. I said, well, why don't you wait? You wait and you determine when you want to tell him, and if you want to tell him, and how you want to tell him. And she waited, and then when the commercials would come up about HIV medications, she would ask him, what'd you think about that? And he always had something negative to say. And she said, he's not somebody I can have this conversation with. And she was glad she didn't tell him, and she stopped seeing him. We tell people that you're living with HIV, you need to tell your partner if you're living with HIV. I used to tell my patients, you determine when you're ready to have that conversation, because not everybody is going to take that information and hold it with care. And if she had have told him when she first started seeing him, who knows what he would have did with that information. And she was already very fragile because she had been raped, and it had just really destroyed her life. Who knows what would have happened if she had have told him and his response had been negative, right? All right. Next slide. There's only one more thing I wanted to say on this. What is this talking about? We already know this. Miss Jackson went over that. You can change. You can go on. Miss Jackson went over that. She went over that as well. You can go to the next slide. In 2012, HIV prevention medication was introduced. That's pre-exposure prophylaxis. That's kind of like your vitamins. You know, you wake up, you take your vitamins. So, you know, some people take a vitamin C in the wintertime, and some people take a vitamin D, and all these other vitamins people like to take, right, to prevent them from getting something or feeling not so well, or whatever the case may be. That's what your PrEP is. When we look at PrEP was actually, the first medication was approved. It was manufactured by the company I work for, but do you know who fought for the approval of the medication? Gay white men. They went and they lobbied for the approval of the medication. They said, our communities are dying. This is going to save our lives. We want to be able to purchase it. So when you look across who's using HIV prevention, who's aware of it, we were not in the conversations early on, so we have to do a lot of work to educate our communities on it. Currently today, there are 4 medications for HIV prevention, and at least 2 more on the way. There's an everyday pill, there's an every 2-month shot, there's a every 6-month shot, which is extremely expensive, and then there is, in the coming months, there will be an every month oral. So there are lots of options for people. But people have to first know about them. Having a tool in your house that can fix something that's wrong in your house does you no good if you don't know what the tool is or how to get to it, right? So we have to make sure we're educating people on what prevention is, and letting people know that just because you talk about prevention doesn't mean that people are going to have more sex just because you're educating them on prevention. There's a couple of studies that really show that just because you talk to people about prevention and you put people on prevention, they didn't see an increase in the number of sexual encounters people were having. But what they did see was an increase in the number of times people were coming in asking questions about their sexual health, because they were playing an active role, right? You have to empower people to play an active role in their health. In 2024, Hidea, I always mispronounce her name, but she died. So she was on Oprah show years and years ago. She was a young girl living with HIV. I don't think that she died from HIV-related complications, but I don't honestly remember what she died from. But she was an activist. She had to be like 8 or 9 when she was on the Oprah show, talking about living with HIV. And so she did recently die. Okay, next slide. Magic Johnson, and then that's Alvin Ailey. Next slide. U equals U. Did we talk about that? We didn't talk about that, did we? U equals U. I think Ms. Jackson talked a little bit about U equals U. So U equals U is this very empowering thing. So if I'm living with HIV and I take my medication, then it means that I'm undetectable, right? And that means that I cannot pass HIV to any of my partners. And it's a very empowering statement for individuals living with HIV. But what we don't talk about is the fact that it's a snapshot in time. If I go to the doctor today and I'm taking my medication and they draw my blood, it's going to say that I'm undetectable, and so I'm U equals U. But if I walk out that door and stop taking my medication, I am no longer U equals U. I am now B equals V. Viremia equals vulnerability. And so that is why it's important that people understand what U equals U is and what it is not. If someone says, oh yeah, I'm undetectable, yeah, that talks about the last 30 days. Doesn't say anything about today or tomorrow or the next day, because life happens. People forget their medications, people choose to stop taking them, people can no longer afford them. U equals U is empowering, but we also have to make sure that individuals who choose to be in relationships with individuals who are living with HIV recognize that it's a snapshot in time. And you can be with an individual who's living with HIV and they can take their medication. I had a patient who, she could never take her medicine. She was living with HIV, she never was undetectable. And her husband came to me for PrEP because he was like, I'll try to get her to take her medicine and I cannot do it. So I'm gonna take PrEP because I wanna still have sex with my wife, but I don't wanna get HIV. And so he took PrEP because she just could not get on her medication. She recently got on her medication because she had a baby and sent me a picture. And the baby's got to be about a year. So she was able to get it together to have a baby. But it's important that people in those relationships know, because then you need to decide how you want to proceed, right? You have to be able to inform and educate. Okay, next slide. Okay, you can build it out. Should be a build. Oh, there's nothing on there? Okay, well, I'll talk about the prevention strategies. They were on the slide. Maybe I sent you the old copy that I was working on. So the branded medications for prevention are gonna be Truvada, Descovy, 2 oral pills, Apretude, which is an every 2-month injection, and then there's a new every 6-month injection called Yes2Go. And those are, most of them are available for anyone. Descovy, women cannot take. There's no testing done in women, but the other 3 are available to anybody. And they can go to any of their providers and be able to get access to the medication. And the prevention medications are not a complete HIV regimen. They're only part of an HIV regimen. So a prevention regimen is gonna be 1 or 2 drugs, whereas a treatment regimen is typically 2 or 3 drugs. And so it's important because people start Googling if they see somebody taking Truvada or Descovy, like, oh, you got HIV. Not necessarily. It's also used for prevention. And it's important to know that medications used to treat HIV are also used to prevent HIV. Next slide. Next slide. I don't know why they didn't build out. I don't know what happened. It didn't build out. I don't know. I must have sent her the wrong one. Or me. It's me. User error. I sent the wrong version. I think that's all I really wanted to say. I wanted to just not put a bunch of data out there, a bunch of facts, but really try to have a conversation. Do you all have any questions, any thoughts, any comments about any of the things that we talked about? I'm happy to go in more detail, but I did want to give high-level information and hopefully things that you can take back and share with other members of your family and your friends and your neighbors. Any questions, comments?
I'm a retired registered nurse, and back in the 80s,
Yes, ma'am.
I was working in a small hospital in a small town. The doctors didn't know what to do when we had these patients that wasn't, so we transferred them all to Philadelphia. Then after a while, Philadelphia said, don't send anymore because we don't know what to do. So we were struggling. I remember those early years of HIV. Nobody knows what to do. We put them in isolation. But I just want to thank you and the doctors, researchers. We've come a long ways.
Yes, ma'am.
And it's such a joy to see the success that we made since the 1980s.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes, and you know, you bring up a good point. There's been a lot of successes that have been made, and I think we've come a long way, but we pretend like there aren't people that are still dying of AIDS today, right? I remember losing at least 3 patients to AIDS, and it was because for whatever reason they couldn't take their medication or they wouldn't take it. And so we do, I think, in the Black community have a lot of work to do, because there is something that prevents people from wanting to take their medication. And it's not because they don't want to take care of themselves, right? It's because some of the stigma, some of the racism, some of just the historical process around HIV in the Black community has really left a bad taste in our mouth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, that was wonderful. I can't wait to have our discussion. We're going to actually, after Mr. Brown speaks, we're going to move our discussion into the fellowship hall where we have some refreshment. But I'd like to introduce to you now Aaron Brown. Aaron, hold on, technology. Please hold. Aaron Brown is a PrEP specialist at the University of Rochester, Department of Medicine's Infectious Disease Unit. He actually does a lot of community outreach and education. Hold on. Technology. He's a prominent health educator and community advocate. He has expanded, actually has a column, an online column called Ask Aaron. He authors a dedicated sexual health advice column through the Rochester Victory Alliance. He answers community questions regarding HIV prevention, navigating relationships with HIV-positive partners, and the logistics of starting or maintaining PrEP. As a public speaker, he serves as a subject matter expert for local health discussions such as WDKX Check Your Health series, where he discusses the state of HIV in Rochester, alongside the University of Rochester Medical Center's infectious disease specialists. He is described as a bold champion for healthy sex. He leads outreach efforts to destigmatize sexual health conversations and provides confidential consultations for individuals navigating healthcare providers' discussions. Please welcome Aaron Brown.
Hey y'all, how y'all doing? Do I look okay? Okay, that's important. I had, first of all, I would like to thank everyone who invited me to be here today. Thank you so much, Bishop Wilson. I had a big introduction planned, and usually with other groups that I talk to, I'll talk about, do you enjoy healthy sex and all those things, but recognizing the audience today, as I was getting dressed, I was remembering growing up in Rochester before I moved away and decided to be grown. And growing up as a young Black queer kid going to a Black church on 580 St. Paul Street and sitting in pews like these, and it just made me remember growing up and the things I used to hear growing up in the 80s and the 90s about queer people and about AIDS And it made me change my introduction to just being able to say thank you. Thank you all for opening these doors. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for being willing to have a conversation that for so long, too many sanctuaries were afraid to touch. I stand before you today as a black man who grew up in these pews during the heights of the AIDS movement. And I remember the hymns, and I remember the prayers and the hushed tones, if it was ever spoke about at all. I remember the funerals. I remember the really hot sanctuaries with church fans being waved and certain people putting the church fans over their face so they can be able to have discreet conversations about what happened to them. And that plays in my head over and over. I remember choirs singing through tears and questions that they didn't have answers to yet. So today, after everybody presented the statistics and the facts and the slides and the information, I just wanted to have a moment of reflection with you all. Back in that day, it felt like HIV was a storm that went past, right? But yet here we are. Because of researchers who refuse to quit, because of people like Sister Jackie Dozier, who I call Aunt Jackie, who remained in our communities, consistently bringing in people to get tested. For people like Reverend Jackson as a nurse, but also as a prayer warrior for people who needed care. Because of doctors and nurses and activists and everyday people who demanded better. Because of clinical trials and late nights in laboratories. Because of brave patients who wanted to try something new. HIV is no longer a guaranteed death sentence. Today, people live with HIV and live long, healthy, and beautiful lives. With prevention tools like PrEP, undetectable means untransmittable. With prevention measures that people can be able to still have children. And like Dr. Baxter spoke about before, there are less and less babies being born with AIDS, something they weren't able to do anything about. Now we have injectables that you can take every 2 months to prevent you from getting HIV. There's an injectable you can take every 2 months to treat you for HIV. But all that information has not been given or made known to be accessible to people who look like us. And Dr. Backus made us really aware of the reasons why. That is not a small feat. That's pretty big. It's actually miraculous. But family, we can't celebrate the future without telling the truth about the past. We can't celebrate the science without remembering the souls that we lost at that time. So with a show of hands, does anybody know anybody living with HIV right now? And with a show of hands, does anybody know anyone who died from AIDS? So just do me a quick favor and close your eyes and see that person's face and say their names in your head. You don't have to say it out loud. Because there are some of us who remember, and there are some of us who don't, that we lost preachers, we lost sons and daughters, we lost mothers, we lost whole choirs worth of voices, and too often, we lost them in silence. So today, we honor them. We say their absence matters, their lives matters, their stories still matter. Now, as you open your eyes today, I want you to remember that there's a complicated part here, and that is that where medicine caught up, where treatment became effective, and when HIV stopped being the headline crisis in the news, the world went quiet, almost too quiet, right? But in our community, Black communities, HIV never disappeared. It stopped being talked about. It stopped being what people focused on. And that's how stigma grows. And when stigma grows, people hide. And when people hide, they stop getting tested. And when people stop getting tested, they stop being aware. When people stop being aware, they start being sick. That's a pipeline of stigma, and that's the pipeline of shame. But let me say something plainly. In this era, people rarely die from HIV itself. They die from the effects of stigma. They die from shame and from isolation, from the fear of being judged by the virus itself. Now, although I was raised by a Pentecostal preacher and a village of praying women like most of the women in this audience, I don't know everything about the Bible, but what I do know is that stigma is not of God. Shame is not something that's given from God. And silence that harms does not come from God. If we believe in a God of love, then we must believe that love is informed, and a love that is compassionate, a love that makes room at the table for everyone, positive, negative, questioning, learning, gay, straight, trans, everyone. And while we're telling the truth, we might as well say this: women have been left out of the conversation, forgotten in sermons, forgotten in campaigns, forgotten in funding priorities, but they have not been forgotten in the statistics. Women everywhere, Black women, continue to be affected by HIV in ways that are often overlooked because they are our caregivers, they are our mothers, they are our partners, our leaders, and too often they end up navigating stigma alone. And if we're going to be a faith community that reflects God's love, then we have to widen the lens. Because HIV is not just a gay issue, it's not a young people's thing, it's not a white people's thing. It's not a somebody else's thing. AIDS and HIV is a human thing, and it requires us as a faith community to remember that the first H in HIV is humanity. I think about sitting on that pew as a kid, trying to reconcile what I heard about love and what God's love felt like. And then watching the AIDS crisis unfold, hearing prayers for healing, but not always hearing prayers for understanding. And if you told that kid one day that he would be standing up in the church, not hiding, not shrinking, not whispering, not asking to be heard, but instead speaking boldly about people loving other people, he wouldn't believe you. But today, I am not just a witness of loss from that time. I'm a witness to progress. I'm a witness to resilience. And right now, as I look out at all of you, I'm a witness to God's love. Not the kind of love that excludes, and not the kind of love that shames, but the kind of love that shows up for people, the kind of love that listens, the kind that says your sexual health matters, your health matters, your life matters, but most of all, your dignity matters. So, here's our call to action. Let's talk about sexual health openly. Let's talk about HIV openly in our ministries, in our small groups, in our homes. Let's encourage testing as an act of stewardship, not suspicion. Let's learn that PrEP and treatment are important to our community so we can be able to shift myths from facts. Let's check on the women in our lives and make sure that they are not carrying this conversation alone and doing the work themselves. Let's make sure that this place becomes a church where someone living with HIV can walk in without fear and walk out knowing that they are loved. And when you all start the prayer this evening, remember the names that I asked you about earlier? Say their names. Say their names in your prayer so that heaven can hear you. And we know that faith without action is incomplete. And love without courage is quiet and silence. So today, let's choose courage. Let's choose gratitude for researchers, for the activists, for the caretakers, for the survivors that we lost, and for those who knew how to be able to take action. But most of all, for the God who carried us through it all. As the person who grew up during the AIDS movement and who became the grown man standing in this sanctuary, witnessing a community willing to lean in instead of look away, I recognize this as holy. I recognize this as righteousness. And I recognize this as God's love. Thank you so much for having me.
I don't know what I can say after that. Thank you again so much. Before we have our closing oh, sorry, I'm shorter. Before we have our closing prayer by Reverend Lois Goldburn, I'd just like to thank everyone again for coming this evening. As we close out our first day of the week of prayer for HIV/AIDS, I want to give a heartfelt thanks to Reverend Wilson, Reverend Goldburn, to Sheila on AV extraordinaire, logistics queen, to all of our church leaders that are here with us from Genesee Baptist Church today, thank you for being here. Thank you for all of you taking the time this afternoon to be with us. The leadership shown today has really set a powerful tone for this week of reflection. I want to also thank Common Ground Health for partnering and really coordinating this. The Reverend Phyllis Jackson, thank you. To our amazing speakers, Dr. Natalie LeBlanc, Dr. Candace Backus, and Mr. Aaron Brown. We are reminded that faith and knowledge walk hand in hand. Let this be our call to action, to replace the myths with facts, fear with understanding, and stigma with love. Let us commit to being ambassadors of truth, sharing accurate information, extending grace, and standing in solidarity with those affected by HIV and AIDS. We hope everyone leaves encouraged, informed, and empowered to carry something meaningful from this discussion into your homes, your workplaces, and your communities. Let us know now to continue the conversation and our fellowship across the hall. May what we have received today not only stay with us, but be moved throughout our communities. At this time, I'd like to ask Reverend Lois Goldburn to close us out in prayer. Thank you.
Let us pray. Father God, we want to thank you. Thank Dr. Debbie Stamps and for all the speakers and for all the people that are here as we celebrate the National Week of Prayer for the healing of AIDS. We thank you for the knowledge we've gained today. God, you have richly provided us with everything, our health and our strength. We pray for complete healing to all your children. Continue to bless your children and meet all of their needs. And Father God, bless their families and all the caretakers. Father, as we leave this place, let us leave with the joy of the Lord, because you brought us a mighty long ways from the 80s. And we say thank you. We give you all the honor and praise. Please hear our prayer now in the precious name of Jesus Christ. Amen.